So if the United States goes to war with Iran, big picture, that's good for Russia, bad for Ukraine. Now, that's not a reason in of itself to make the decision to strike or not to strike, but it shows that all of this is connected. So I thought it was worth talking through that a bit today. Now, starting out, we are seeing that a lot of Russians are, of course, monitoring this conflict, and some of them are getting kind of pissed off, saying, why is Israel able to do these things seemingly so easy, and we can't? A good list of gripes, I think is the best way to put it, comes from the Russian Rusich Group, which is a rough organization, right? Neo-Nazi, self-proclaimed Nazis. So top to bottom, pretty bad organization here. But they said, hey, Israel's been at war with Iran for a couple of days. We've been at war with Ukraine for a couple of years. Israeli aviation bombs Iranian targets without losses and has complete air superiority. Russian aviation loses more aircraft than it produces during the operation. I mean, notably, as we're recording this, there's been one confirmed aerial shootdown in Iran so far, and it was a Hermes drone shot down yesterday that we actually have confirmation of. All the rest of the ridiculous claims have 5 F-35s, by the way, is what Iran has claimed to have shot down. It's just AI, weird AI images is the best they've been able to produce. So, yes, Israel has air superiority, air supremacy over portions of Iran. That has never been the case with Russia and Ukraine. Just a few days ago, we got footage of a Russian aircraft shooting down another Russian jet. Friendly fire, bringing their own guys down. Of course, a couple weeks ago, we had the drone attack inside of Russia where Russian or Ukrainian drones took out a bunch of strategic aviation on the airfields. And, maybe in the opening days, there were probably a couple areas along the front where Russian aircraft had relative air superiority. But that went away pretty quick. And for years now, you're not seeing Russian aircraft cross the line of contact. In most cases, they're not even coming within a couple kilometers of the front. They're firing their missiles and dropping their bombs. I mean, that was kind of the design of those glide bombs, is that they can drop them without even having to cross the line of contact for fear of being shot down. There are very stark difference in how these two conflicts are playing out, and the Russians are noticing, saying, wait a minute, why is this so different? They add that Israel destroyed the top of the military political administration of Iran, while Russia cannot even strike the decision-making center, let alone eliminate the military political administration of Ukraine. Again, in the opening hours of this operation, 20, maybe upwards of 30 Iranian senior leaders were eliminated, and we've never seen that at all, even from the opening days of this conflict with Russia. Doesn't appear they're able to at this point, I think is a safe way to put it. They say Israeli air defenses repelled hundreds of missiles and only a few reached their targets, whereas Russian air defenses allow light engine crop duster aircraft to pass on through. Now, to be fair to the Russians in this case, that is a much larger area to defend against. The Russian-Ukrainian border is significantly larger than what Israel has to defend against. But nonetheless, they're raising the point that it seems like their air defense is better too. They say Israeli intelligence agencies act in Iran as if they were at home. There is virtually no activity of Russian special services in Ukraine, no sabotage operations behind enemy lines, nothing to the extent of what we've seen Mossad do in Iran in recent days, which, enemy territory, for sure, has been for a long time. It's not like they were all good with each other and could have infiltrated in recent days. There were a lot of collaborators that they recruited. And Russia looking at this saying, you're telling me we couldn't do that at all? Haven't been able to figure that out? They also say Israel strikes Iranian TV channels, whereas Russia is unable to stop Ukrainian television. And lastly, they say it turns out a full-scale war means throwing freshly mobilized meat at the front in huge quantities and not with technology. So again, very stark differences in how these two, nation versus nation wars are playing out. And it's nice to see some inside of Russia are saying, wait a minute, if we're really a top-tier military, how come Israel's doing all these things so easily and we never could? We'll see if that actually follows through with anything. But turning back to what this war means for what the possibility of a U.S.-Iran war would mean for this specific conflict, I want to start on the Russian side. And overall, not a lot of impact. We're probably going to see a reduction in direct support, any sort of mutual support between Iran and Russia. They would both be, and they are right now, pretty occupied with their own defense. This is not going to significantly impact the drone production that Russia uses to fire against Ukraine. I saw some folks point to that. Yes, there are still some Iranian drones making their way to Russia, but by and large, the majority of what Russia is firing into Ukraine day in and day out is produced inside of Russia and has been for quite a while. Now, there's some rumors that some of that production has moved to North Korea, but Either way, if the pipeline shut off entirely from Iran and went to zero, like it probably has in recent days, you're not going to see a drastic change in terms of the actual munitions being fired day in and day out. On the other side, don't expect Russia to be able to do much to help Iran. Again, Russia relatively occupied with their own war. Now, in terms of what this means for Ukraine, bottom line, it's going to be diverting U.S. assets and attention. We've already seen the diversion of assets. Was it a week or two ago? We saw reports that Secretary Hegseth of the U.S. Department of Defense had reallocated anti-drone rockets that were set aside and purchased for Ukraine to down these Shaheds. Those were instead moved to U.S. forces in the Middle East, which was kind of a little leading indicator that there might have been something coming up here soon. We've also seen the U.S. surge assets into the region. Another carrier strike group moving over. We've seen refueling aircraft in recent months. This was originally tied to the Houthi threat, but they're still there. Air defense batteries, additional aircraft, all sorts of stuff. It's got our focus. That kind of brings to the last piece here, where everything in the U.S. government right now seems to be focused on Israel and Iran. They're shifting focus away from Russia and Ukraine. Now, this is kind of a short-term surge, but if the United States gets directly involved in this conflict, you would expect that we're probably going to pay more attention to that than a conflict that we are not directly involved in. In fact, I think this was kind of summed up, unfortunately, very well by Senator Lindsey Graham, who's been pushing a sanctions package recently. And just, I think it was earlier today, he said, yeah, listen, Iran is center stage right now. This is what we're focused on. We haven't forgotten about Russia and Ukraine, but the sanctions that was on the verge of being put forward for a vote, it's going to have to wait. So the best case scenario here for Russia is that the United States gets pulled in. The best case scenario here for Ukraine is that Israel is able to handle this on their own. And at the end of the day, the Iranian nuclear threat is eliminated, and that would potentially be a net, outside of all of the benefits on itself that brings. If the United States doesn't have to worry about a nuclear Iran, it could free up some resources to go to Ukraine. But that's kind of the big picture view of how that conflict affects this one. Now, turning to some updates from Ukraine, just on June 17th, Russia launched one of their largest drone and missile attacks so far of the war. I'm tracking 440 drones and 32 missiles. That strike alone damaged around 150 residential buildings in Kyiv. We've got some crazy footage showing these strikes. And the most recent estimate that I have seen is that strike led to the death, killed 28 people, including an American citizen, and wounded 134 more. So massive strike by all metrics. President Zelensky spoke to this, where he went on site and he said, "Today I was at the site where a Russian high-explosive missile struck a residential building in Kyiv." Real quick, let me show you one of these clips of the drone hitting the residential compound. That right there. Like, Russia, on the one hand, talks about how accurate their munitions are. This is hard to explain, right? Like, that flies directly into the side of what is very clearly, in daylight hours, a residential building. Anyway, Zelensky says this vile attack claimed the lives of 23 civilians. Again, my understanding is that number has now increased to 28. My condolences to their families and loved ones. Assistance for all those affected is ongoing. This strike is a reminder to the world that Russia spurns a ceasefire and chooses to kill. And he added in a separate statement, if last year the use of 100 Shaheeds in one night caused a real shock, now it seems unusual if less than 100 drones are used in a single attack. In fact, this is the only real change in Russian behavior since the change of the U.S. president. And there was a graph put together by Jay in Kyiv over on X that I wanted to share. I don't know if he made it or if he just sourced it from somewhere, but his account is where I saw it, showing what is very clearly an increase in Russian drone strikes since President Trump came into office in January. Hard to say if that's the reason or if the production was just ramping up and that's where it got there, or if they at that point decided that it was time to ramp up because they thought the president might not be on board with continued aid to Ukraine. But either way, we have seen in the last few months a noticeable increase in Russian strikes into Ukraine. Now, I did want to turn over to some updates here on the map showing the battlefield updates along the front. There's two key areas we're going to look at today, starting out in the southeast section, so southeast portion of the front here, using Deep State Map, a publicly available resource. It'll be linked in the description below. This is kind of one of the key areas here, Pokrovsk, a logistics hub in eastern Ukraine. And we've seen, being able to back up a little bit on this map, you can see that Russia is kind of trying to envelop Pokrovsk from a couple different directions. In fact, we did see an attack earlier today. There's not a lot of progress. We did see an attack earlier today in this area, the Konstantinovka. And we actually have a video of that attack that was repelled by Ukrainian forces. We'll go ahead and play that here. Nice daytime armored assault forward. Gotta assume those things are packed full of infantry, probably the modified troop carriers we've seen in recent months. So anyways, according to Ukrainian sources here, they say this assault was repelled by Ukrainian forces of the 36th Separate Marine Brigade, the 54th Mechanized Brigade, and the 101st Security Brigade using artillery, anti-tank systems like ATGMs, and drone strikes. Haven't seen the artillery quite yet. It doesn't look like any mines, although I wouldn't be surprised if those kind of known travel routes, you can see they're well worn, are probably heavily mined by Ukraine as well. They're finding really good ways, really effective ways to remotely mine some of these areas, even with drones, being able to set them in place. That looks like a drone, just kind of the top, looks like an explosion from the top down. Nonetheless, at least a couple vehicles hit there. And you'll see the overall wrap-up here, according to Ukraine. We'll see it play out in this video. They say 14 armored vehicles destroyed and around 50 personnel killed and wounded, and then 6 motorized transport units also destroyed. So motorized transports, look at that. It's kind of the, like this modified transports is definitely the way to look at these. They've got the shield, the protective cover all around them, coming in from all these different directions, just one after the other, right? One gets hit, next one follows, that one gets hit, next one follows. And you can start to see the infantry dismount. So even if the vehicle is disabled, it's hard to tell how far away from the line of contact. There's another drone strike against one of the vehicles as it stops. It's hard to tell how far away from the line of contact these guys are getting dropped. It does look like some sort of berm or anti-tank ditch there. Maybe they've decided now is the time to dismount. They look like they're running the wrong direction. Maybe it's just the camera angle, but it looks like they dismounted and went backwards. Nonetheless, the vehicles all that's as far forward as they're able to go, and now you're seeing that there is artillery. You're starting to see artillery rain down on the stationary tanks, but nonetheless, this attack continued in for another couple minutes here, where it's the same thing, just vehicles moving forward, can't progress any further. There you go, straight into the anti-tank ditch. Anti-tank ditches, drone strikes, ATGMs, and then eventually artillery wiping out this entire assault. So pretty interesting that we are continuing to see those tactics play out. Now, moving back to the map here, the other area I wanted to talk about was up here north in Sumy. This is an area we've actually seen a pretty, all things considered, rapid Russian advance. We'll go back as rapid as it's been in a long time. So go back to the beginning of the month, and you can see that there's actually been a fair amount of progress in recent days. We are zoomed in pretty far, but nonetheless, compared to other sections of the front, they are continuing to move forward and get closer and closer to Sumy down here, which is coming up on FPV range. We're going to talk about that here in a second. But there's an interesting article in Ukrainian Pravda talking about what happened here and the challenges. They start out by saying the withdrawal of Ukrainian forces from Kursk, which was in this area here by Sudza, entailed the loss of control not only over Russian but also Ukrainian territory. They say in recent months, the Russian armed forces have occupied about 10 settlements on the Sumy border and are developing an offensive in 3 more. So this red area on the map here is Ukrainian territory currently occupied by Russian forces. The green, it's a little confusing here, the green is territory taken by Russia back at the start of the war in 2022, since liberated by Ukraine. At this point, I think it might be kind of helpful if they remove that from the map. I'm not sure if I have the ability to do that, but I don't think that's an option over here on the side, but nonetheless, that's the color differences here. That article went on to explain some of the challenges in the Sumy region. They say, for starters, combat-ready brigades were transferred to other portions of the front, which degraded the defensive capabilities, and a lot of the defensive structures here along the border were built back in 2014. They were poorly staffed, poorly equipped, and not up to the rigor of modern combat. They also added that a lot of the roads here, and I've seen some Ukrainians complaining about this, a lot of the roads towards the rear, like to move troops up to the front, the protective nets, the drone coverings were not added in time. And the frustration was people saying there's no excuse for that. There's absolutely no reason why these should not have been put in place even sooner. Now, when looking at the Sumy offensive here, something to keep in mind is that Russia is likely trying to get within artillery range. They're definitely within rocket artillery range right now from some of these areas, but tube artillery would make it to where they can just start raining down shells inside of Sumy and make it uninhabitable for a large portion of the population. The other concern is FPV drones. When will they be able to get within range to start hitting the city center with FPV drones? They're close, but not there yet. Again, according to a Ukrainian soldier here, he says the operational range of most of these FPV drones is 15 kilometers, whereas the distance from the nearest Russian positions to Sumy is at least 18 to 20 kilometers. So even if this map is just a couple days out of date, right, they're not quite there. He says, moreover, drone launch positions are typically set 5 kilometers away from the contact line. So it's not as though the Russian drones are going to be launched from right here, the forwardmost position, right? They're going to be back a little bit, just like we traditionally would use artillery. He says everyone measures the gray zone or the edge of the occupied area and says it's 20 to 25 kilometers to Sumy, but the launch point is at least 5 kilometers back. So if the Russians are 20 to 25 kilometers from Sumy, the drone's range needs to cover 35 kilometers. And they're talking about how as that range increases, the actual payload decreases. And right now they say, there's no real reason for Russia to be hitting Sumy with these small FPV drones, especially because the munition that they'd be utilizing at that point is, borderline the size of a grenade. They said you'd essentially be terrorizing the population at the cost of a relatively valuable, not money-wise, but could be used for other purposes, fiber optic FPV-style drone. So as it sits right now, it does not look like Sumy is inside of FPV range, but that would change the fight in this direction pretty significantly, pretty rapidly. But overall, I thought it was worth diving into just some ideas of how the other war might affect this war, especially if the United States gets involved. It's a lot to keep track of. I got it. Trying my best to be able to keep discussing and keep understanding both conflicts, because I think both are very, very important to not just us here in the United States, but people all around the world. So appreciate your patience as I spent a little more time recently discussing the Israel-Iran stuff. Don't want to let this slip, if you will. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.